Welcome back to another selection of poems. This is Jim Ransom with another edition of Morning Jim Poetry. Today we're going to concentrate on some representative poets of the 19th century. There were a lot of them, as poets were often published in the newspapers and often commented on affairs of the day. I can't do all of them justice, so we'll focus on three poets of great influence, all with different styles and messages. And we're going to start with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Longfellow was probably the most successful poet in America once he finally got his stride. And he was often paid as much as $3,000 per poem. Can you imagine what that would amount to in today's world? His estate was worth nearly $400,000 at his death. That would be maybe $4 million today. But not long after his death, he began to be denigrated by some modernist critics who said he wrote only children's poems. Well, it so happens that one of these so-called children's poems that he wrote was one that I was introduced to at a fairly early age in grade school. So the critics were right about that. But nevertheless, it's a very typical Longfellow poem, and it's called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One, if by land, and two, if by sea. And I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm." Then he said, "Good night," and with muffled oar silently rowed to the Charleston shore, just as the moon rose over the bay where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend, through alley and street, wandered and watches with eager ears till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed the tower of the old North Church by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade, by the trembling ladder steep and tall to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and looked down a moment on the roofs of the town and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath, in the churchyard, lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, "All is well." A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead, for suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide, like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred, with a heavy stride on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed at the landscape, far and near, then, impetuous, stamped the earth and turned and tightened his saddle girth, but mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still, and lo, as he looks, on the belfry's height a glimmer, and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes, till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath, from the pebbles in passing, a spark struck out by a steed flying fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic. Meeting the ocean tides, and under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work that they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock. Then he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown. And one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest. In the books you have read how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear. A voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore, for borne on the night wind of the past, through all our history, to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will awaken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Well, that was a poem that was very moving and very convincing to the boys and girls in my class when we read it. And I can't remember whether we were tasked with reading it in turns or whether the teacher read it to us. But I still remember that it was a very moving poem for children to hear. So maybe it wasn't quite fair to have the critics say that he wrote only children's poems. After all, don't children need poetry too? I think so. Okay, who's next? Next, I picked out Emily Dickinson. Her life overlapped that of Longfellow. She was born in 1830 and died in 1886. But as far as I can tell, they did not meet or correspond. Dickinson never married, and except for a few poems, her work was not published until well after her death by family members who found them stitched into book-like packets. However, we have to say that Emily Dickinson kept on a vast correspondence with friends, not men and women, all over her community and beyond. And so there were a lot of people who had been exposed to some of her poems. She frequently included them in the letters she sent to her friends. Her father was a lawyer and very domineering. While his son married and joined the father's law practice, Emily stayed home and wrote her poems. She was frequently writing about death. She never titled her poems, so the titles are the first lines. And I'm going to read one that's entitled The Bustle in the House. The bustle in a house the morning after death is solemnest of industries enacted upon earth. The sweeping up the heart and putting love away we shall not want to use again until eternity. That's a brief, tightly written poem about cleaning up our mental house after someone dies. The bustle in a house the morning after death is solemnest of industries enacted upon earth. The sweeping up the heart and putting love away we shall not want to use again until eternity. That's a very good poem. And I can understand why her poetry has become popular once again, because it shares much in common with many modern poems and poets. And here's another. It's called Hope is the Thing with Feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land, and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. That's typical of Emily Dickinson. The ending and the meaning of her poems are often simple phrases, but with a lot of deep meaning attached to them. Hope is the thing with feathers. If it hadn't been for her family members, her sister-in-law primarily, who found all of these hand-stitched together collections of poems, over 1,000 of them. She probably never would have been published. And the most frequent and complete edition of her works really didn't hit the shops until 1995. I would say that Emily Dickinson is much more apt to be read in the modern world than Longfellow is. Finally, here's our third poet, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman. He was born in 1819 and lived until 1892. And he had a hard time finding an audience. He wrote mostly in free verse. He never rhymed. And he had to self-publish his most famous book called Leaves of Grass in 1855 because he couldn't find a publisher. But he sent it around, gave it to friends. It made its rounds and caught on. And later, this self-published book became a landmark for modern poetry. Here's a poem from that book. It's called For You, O Democracy. Come, I will make the continent indissoluble. I will make the most splendid race the sun ever shone upon. I will make divine magnetic lands with a love of comrades, with a lifelong love of comrades. I will plant companionship thick as trees along all the rivers of America, and along the shores of the Great Lakes, and all over the prairies. I will make inseparable cities with their arms about each other's necks, by the love of comrades, by the love of comrades. For you, these from me, O democracy, to serve you, ma femme. For you, I am trilling these songs. That's a beautiful and heartfelt lyric. And that's how he felt about America, too. Unfortunately, we have a lot of our citizens today who don't feel that way. More's the pity. Finally, here's another poem by Walt Whitman. It's called I Hear America Singing. I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam, the mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work, the boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck, the shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench, the hatter singing as he stands, the woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon intermission, or at sundown, the delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her, and to none else. The day, what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. That's from his selected poems that wasn't published until 1991. Amazing man, Walt Whitman, and it took him a long time to be recognized for his originality. And he was criticized early in his career when it came out that he maybe was gay. And of course, that was a real no-no in those days. And now I'm not sure I agree that we should be proud of it if that's what we are. But we have gay pride parades in the U.S. in our time. More strength to them. And Walt Whitman would be there, and he would be singing about that too, you can be sure, if he was still alive. Well, okay. That's it for today. We've gone longer than we usually do, but it's hard to find a short poem by Longfellow. I guess he was maybe paid by the word, I'm not sure, but he made a lot of money with his poetry. All these poets improved American poetry in the 19th century, and all of them influence us today. Good for them. We need a lift. Bye now.